Right. I think we will go ahead and get started on our next session, which will start with three short presentations from the members of the paper trail. So I'll be starting with a presentation about things to kind of consider when you're applying for graduate school and during graduate school. Then Bria will talk about some mental health resources, and then Quentin will talk about things to consider kind of after graduate school. So I wanted to say that before I start on kind of my presentation about what you should consider or things you can consider when applying for graduate school, that there are a lot of really great resources on this. Even if you just kind of Google these things, there are some really nice things. And especially in this presentation, I think Daniel Gonzalez's website is really an amazing resource, both for applying to graduate school, being a prospective PhD student, but also in other parts of your career. He has some great kind of faculty application resources as well. So I drew from some of his website for this presentation, but also university websites have a lot of good information as well. So I'd encourage you to look at those too. So in this presentation, I'll touch on a few things, and I won't go into much detail on any of them. We'll have some other sessions that might kind of cover similar things in more depth. But I think these are just kind of things I think are important to keep in mind at various stages of graduate applications and graduate school. And I think it's also important that not everything I'm saying may be perfectly applicable for everyone. I think everyone's situation is different. These are things that I found to be important, and other friends of mine in graduate school also, I think, found important as well. So with that, I guess I will get started. And I think in this presentation and these types of presentations, I never really know what types of images to put in. So I put in the first Google image results from different search terms. So these were like graduate school and applying to graduate school. So hopefully these can keep you entertained while I'm talking, but really the text on these slides is kind of the most important thing here. And again, we'll share these after the symposium. Okay, so I think just to start out, and many of you have already thought about some of these things, but I think just when you're starting out thinking about what type of degree you want is important. So master's versus a PhD are two of the kind of big decisions. Some PhD programs you get a master's along the way, some you don't. That may or may not be important, but perhaps more important is the kind of duration of the degree. Of course, a PhD is longer, typically kind of 5 to 6 years in kind of bioengineering, chemical engineering fields, maybe a little bit shorter in chemical engineering, depending on your research. And in a PhD program, you get paid to do your kind of degree requirements. Whereas in a master's, it's shorter, 1 to 2 years. Some can extend to 3 years, I think, but you pay for those degrees typically, but they are shorter. So one thing that I didn't really consider when I was applying is my undergraduate degree was actually in biomedical engineering, and I only applied to biomedical engineering programs for my graduate school. But I think it's important that there are a lot of overlap between different fields. So I could have applied in chemical engineering or material science. And I think that's a good thing to kind of keep in mind. And even kind of outside of engineering, if your training's in engineering, certain programs at schools of medicine, there are certain stem cell programs or bioinformatics programs that might be a really good fit for you. So you can kind of broaden your search if you have specific things in mind. It's of course important to consider what prerequisites are required in terms of courses or research experience for different grad programs. So keep that in mind when you're applying. And then deadlines, which are coming up very soon. I think often they start around December 1st and extend through January, but as many of you I'm sure know, these are coming up very soon. And another thing that I didn't really kind of ask about were fee waivers. So this is something that definitely don't hesitate to ask or send an email to see if there are fee waiver opportunities. These things can get pretty expensive, and if you can get fee waivers, I think that's great. And later on today, I think we'll have some opportunities for fee waivers as well. So the parts of the application typically include transcripts, letters of recommendation, a personal statement, your CV, and then sometimes test scores. Fortunately, many programs now are not requiring the GRE. So I would say, just to touch on these things a little bit, definitely make sure you're asking your letter writers in plenty of time. I would say we're about a month, or we're exactly a month out from December 1st. And now is becoming kind of towards the end of that period where you could ask. I think a month is a reasonable time, but asking before is certainly better. The longer, the better, I think, in this situation. Definitely ask your friends, other undergraduates, colleagues, your letter writers and advisors for help editing and kind of framing your personal statement. This is a really important document in your application. And there are a lot of great examples online, so definitely check those out and search for other examples. Of course, don't copy those down, but I think it's good for generating ideas and getting started. And then one thing, just maybe that is very recent, is I would advise to not use Chat GPT for personal statements. There's an interesting paper written by Mike King about this for faculty applications, and I think in the end, reviewers can tell when something is written by some kind of AI versus a person. So it's fine for kind of generating ideas in the beginning, but you really want to be writing this as your own document. So in terms of the CV, I would look at examples to see what people have included. I have kind of a Venn diagram here of CVs versus resumes, which some of you may be more familiar with resumes than CVs, but just make sure you're including all the relevant information, and ask your advisors for help on this. They're very familiar with CVs and graduate applications. Definitely proofread your CV. This is, again, a very important document in your application, so you want to be doing that a lot. Make sure there's no typos and that it looks good. And it's important to kind of include anything that's relevant, and those can be big or small. I think anything that's relevant may catch someone's eye that you might not be expecting. And then it's important that you also proofread your CV a second or fifth time, just to make sure it's looking good. So I think something else that I have kind of read about, I didn't do in my specific case, but I think reaching out before the application deadline to certain professors, I think, can be a good strategy. I would definitely ask your advisors about this. You don't want to be just sending a generic email to 100 people. That doesn't look good. But if you're really interested in someone's lab, I think it's okay to kind of work with an advisor, or as Bria mentioned before, we're happy to kind of help craft some of these emails. But that can really show you're interested, really throughout the process. And I think it's also important to consider that this process is inherently biased, although it is very slowly becoming more equitable. There's a nice paper earlier this year kind of about this and how to address some of these inequities. But in addition to that, it's also very difficult to kind of predict, and not every person is going to get into every school, and that's okay. So just kind of keep these things in mind as you're applying. So how do you decide where to go? I think there are some really important things. I think I have 4 bullet points on this slide about things to kind of think about when you're making a decision about where to go. So number one, I think, is the people. So oftentimes programs will have kind of visit weekends, or if there aren't opportunities for that, there'll be a Zoom call or something like that. Make sure you're also interviewing the people you're talking to. You want to, be in a place where you're getting along with the people, you're getting along with current students, but also the faculty members. So knowing the people and kind of assessing the people from your perspective is really important. So in addition, of course, especially if you're getting a PhD, you want to kind of know what the research opportunities are. Are there different kind of research themes in the program you're applying for? Is there a hospital if you want to do translational research? I think these types of things are important if it's going to be a good fit for you. I think also the networking community is really important. Locally, if there's a lot of collaboration going on in the university and you're interested in that, that's great. If there are a lot of seminars that bring in people from outside the university, those are good opportunities for networking and finding kind of future jobs. And then kind of looking at alumni. Where are they? Are there alumni events where you can connect with people to kind of look for those next steps? And then, of course, location is really important as well. If there are certain things you like to do, like outdoor things, or you want to be in a city, I think those are important things to consider because you want to be happy in a place you're going to be for 5 or 6 years. Things like proximity to family and friends are important. For me, it was actually important to move away from my family because I'd been so close to them for so long. So I think those things are super important to consider. And then, like, if you want to be in a big city versus a college town, those experiences can be very different. And then depending on your type of research, you may want to consider some state politics and kind of see if there are things that might impact the type of work that you want to do. Um, so I think just a few other points to consider as you're thinking about where to go. What type of jobs do people typically get for after graduation? Some kind of personal financial things that to think about are what's the stipend and overall compensation, including things like health insurance. What's it going to cost me to move to this place? And will there be kind of guaranteed funding for the duration of my PhD? And then what are some requirements of the program? Things like TA requirements. Am I going to be TAing the whole time I'm a PhD student, or do I have to, TA a couple of classes? Those can be kind of big differences in how much time you can spend in certain parts of your research. As well, if there are other types of teaching opportunities, if you're interested, I think some universities allow you to kind of teach your own class, which can be a really great experience. And then if the program allows things like internships, in particular, if you're interested in going to industry after your PhD, if if you can do an internship, I think that's a great way to get your foot in the door with certain companies and just get some more experience. And then if the program has rotations, lab rotations, so if you can choose or rotate between a couple of different labs to kind of figure out where you fit best, I think that's great. But also just considering how advisors are chosen is important as well. So I think to kind of the last point here, a couple of points on how to choose an advisor. And this really depends on the university and you as a person. And there's definitely no perfect system to always match a student and an advisor. I think it's really dependent on what you're looking for, but maybe also what the advisor is looking for. Some advisors are very hands-on. They're in the lab doing experiments with you. Some are very hands-off, never do an experiment, haven't done one in 25 years. Both can work really well depending on your situation. It's also important to kind of consider the lab size, kind of the lab hierarchy, and if there are different stages of different careers. So like if it's a really postdoc heavy lab, really grad student heavy lab, if there are 20 undergraduates and one graduate student, these are kind of all just things to kind of consider when you're making these decisions. And I think you can definitely ask about their mentorship style and see what they think about how they are as a mentor. It's definitely a good question to ask when you're deciding. I think also asking current students, in my experience, grad students are pretty honest about their experiences, which is good. So you can hopefully get some information about mentorship from them. You can also kind of consider the funding situation. If there are a bunch of grants ongoing in the lab, that you'll have a bunch of different potential projects you could work on, a lot of money in the lab to try new things. I think that's a thing to consider for sure. And then, as I mentioned on a previous slide, I think things like rotations or direct admission or ranked matching, just how advisors are chosen, are important as well. And then what projects are available? I think definitely ask about this because lab websites often are not up to date and don't show maybe what's currently going on in the lab. So seeing what types of work you could do is super important as well. Okay, so here I just have a few questions listed about that you should maybe ask yourself in terms of, is this going to be a good fit for me? And I won't kind of read through these. They're just things, again, to kind of ask yourself. And I think Bria will talk about some of these things in her presentation as well. So I'll just kind of pull them up slowly here and you can kind of think about them or read these when we post the slides later. So the last thing I just wanted to talk about is kind of being a well-rounded graduate student and why I think that's important for grad students. So I think number one, it's important for yourself. If you want to be doing things, uh, maybe you don't. If you do want to be doing things outside of the lab, I think that's really important, and it's really important for your mental health, which again, Bria will get into in more detail on her slides. It can also be important for your community. So not just, your university community, but the community that you live in for these number of years. If you can get involved in kind of programs in the community, I think that's really great. And you can feel like you have, a home. It's also important for your lab, your department, and your university. So I think getting involved can really help with all those aspects. These things can be important for fellowships too. So you can write about things, outside of your research that you're doing to better the university or the community as well. And then I think these things are important for future job prospects too. Like I kind of mentioned with the CV, sometimes things that you think are maybe really small really catch someone's attention. And if you're doing things outside of the lab, I think it's a good touch point when you're interviewing for positions. Someone can ask you about that, and you can have a good conversation about something besides research as well. So, how to kind of become a well-rounded graduate student? I think number one, you have to make sure you're doing your degree requirements. That includes coursework and lab work. But as I mentioned, I think other things are super important as well. So I think, at least in my experience, getting involved in some leadership opportunities, whether it's at the department level or even at the university or grad student kind of council level, I think those can be really fun. You can meet a lot of great people too, and meet kind of administrators, different faculty members, so you can kind of broaden your network in those types of things. I think outreach can also be a great opportunity, whether that's scientific. I think those types of things for me are the most kind of applicable. But again, as I mentioned, getting involved in the community or in kind of K-12 outreach, most universities have these kind of programs in place. So checking those out, I think is great. And then mentorship, especially if you're interested in kind of academia, I think mentoring undergraduates, even high school students, or doing some of these more outreach activities can really help kind of bolster your mentorship experience. And then teaching, I mentioned before, but you'll most likely get experience TAing, but if you want and you are really interested in teaching, oftentimes you can develop a new course or even kind of guest lecture in already established courses. And then I think the last thing, at least it was super important for me to kind of maintain some extracurricular activities and hobbies. I really like to be outside, hiking, biking, running, playing soccer, those types of things, playing basketball with my co-host Quentin here. I think those things are all super important. So keep that in mind and make sure you set time aside to do those things. So I think with that, I'll wrap up giving a ton of information there and pass it along to Bria.